Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
And we are coming to you from these United States. I am over here in Des Moines, Iowa, where, like always, it is temperate and never too hot, and the breeze is gently going through the veins of the trees. And I just got more poetic than I bet you can, Bud, about Pittsburgh, where you're at.
Yeah, I'm here at the Newman Institute in Pittsburgh, but no, we are not as beautiful as what you just described.
Well, it's unfair to unmask one's opponent's poetic abilities. So I'm going to point out that it would really be cool to be in Pittsburgh sometimes in the summer, because I'm guessing if the humidity is not too stifling, that the breeze coming off of the three rivers rustling through your various plates of French fries would actually be very comforting sometimes.
Yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with our climate. We get a fair amount of rain, but because of the altitude, I mean, we're not the Rockies or anything, but we're a little higher than you guys, so it stays pretty cool.
Yeah, down in Oklahoma, where I was got to go see family after all these many months. It was good to get to see them. It is already hot. They had like an 85-degree day, and we're already talking about how cool it was. And then I got back to Des Moines, where it was 85, and people were like, kind of a sweltner already. So, things are relative and all of those things like that, I suppose. But we're broadcasting from Iowa Catholic Radio Network. It's wonderful to have all of you with us, all the listeners in Iowa, Oklahoma. Then, of course, everybody who is listening through podcast or on iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app. Thank you for spending your Wednesday with us here in the Uncommon Good. It is always an honor and a pleasure to have all of you with us. As always, we're underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu, to go check that out. The summer semester's already begun. Record numbers doing that, Bud. I think responding to the COVID crisis and really answering the call about how people are answering the call about how they can be an integral part of our community and responding to the health crisis and everything like this. But we're already gearing up for fall, making plans, trying to keep everybody safe and be mindful about what the future will look like. I've been got the privilege to be parts of those plans. So make sure to go check out mchs.edu, Mercy College of Health Sciences, that underwrites the Uncommon Good.
Yeah, I think if people could get a glimpse into some of the courses we teach, they'd feel pretty good about the future of healthcare. And I've been impressed with my servant leadership course this summer. The students just being really flexible and pivoting as our country continues to try to figure out the COVID crisis and all the nitty-gritty details that come with that.
Exactly right. And when you do something with radio or you're on Zoom more and things like this, I get a lot less questions. Sometimes, but in the past when we've been like, oh, we teach at a health science college, they'll kind of look at you and me and go, health sciences, huh? And we're like, don't worry, we don't actually teach anyone how to be healthy. We teach them how to be moral. So when Bud and I have future health problems, they'll be there to help us out.
Well, speak for yourself. No, it's a part of life for all of us. Maybe for some of us, it comes sooner than others. But I think, in all seriousness, Mercy is doing just an amazing job of blending the vision that this Catherine McCauley and the sisters gave us with top-notch professionals.
Yep, it's so Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. Well, Bud, we already talked about the weather, and so usually at this point we bring up food or French fries or sports. But what I want to point out to people is when we start looking at everything that's going on in the news, it's easy to use social media. That's how we stay connected with so many people out there in the field, looking at social media, checking out Twitter and Facebook and some unknown social media that inevitably 20-year-olds are using that I don't understand and I'm not allowed to use. But I know that when we get to talking about whatever is happening, obviously in the news, whatever you want to talk about in 2020, there are several things that you can be talking about in 2020 that the debates that we begin to have, they can either be screaming matches, they can be sort of tribal back and forths. or we can try to show the best of some of our traditions and actually have what I would call real debates, where we like set terms and we try to have debates and figure out things, to the best of our ability. I know many listeners who are listening on Iowa Catholic Radio tune in to Catholic Answers, and Catholic Answers routinely has debates like this where people will debate positions. And so today on the show, we're lucky enough to have one of those people who participated with Trent Horn in a debate recently, Sam Rocha, mutual friend of mutual friends of both Bud and I. And so that's who we're going to have on the show, not necessarily recapping everything that was on the debate, but specifically talking about how it is that the figure of the saints and the lives of the saints can help us understand the terms of debate that we're getting at. And then this is all going to end up being about education, because all three of us are educators, but Sam specifically is a professor of education. So, Bud, looking forward after the break to getting to talk to Sam about all of this.
Yeah, it should be great. Like you were talking about with the events this year, it feels like the political is an issue again. What I mean by that is we were sort of in some ways like coasting as a culture, but now with some of these crises, it's really brought to the fore in a very stark way some of the issues that we tackle on the show. And I think Sam's going to have a lot of wisdom to give us on those matters.
So, folks, you're in for a good one. As always, we appreciate that you tune in and take part of your day to listen to our hour-long show. But you're going to be rewarded greatly. So thank you for joining. This is Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr with The Uncommon Good. Stick around, and we'll be back right after these messages. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for taking time to listen to the show. We're glad to have you here. Our guest on the show today is Dr. Sam Rocha, Associate Professor of Philosophy of Education in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, a prolific writer and musician with several books worth checking out, including A Primer for Philosophy and Education, Folk Phenomenology, and 3 albums to his name, Freedom for Love, Late to Love, and Anamnesis. You can learn more about all of his work at Sam Rocha, so SamRocha.com. Sam, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you enjoy out there.
So, Sam, people might have got the chance to listen to you on this radio station. So Iowa Catholic Radio tunes in with Catholic Answers live for one of their shows. But you got to have a debate with Trent Horn. And the topic was, can Catholics be socialist? And I might be messing up the exact title of the debate. But what I was really interested in and thought was just food for a lot of thought that I wanted to talk about on the show today is not necessarily to reprise the entire debate, but that when you gave your case out of the gate, instead of trying to sort of go by textbook definitions or dictionary, sort of like this, that, or the others, you immediately went to blesseds and venerables and saints who lived lives that were, if not socialist themselves, were at least socialist adjacent, if that's the way you could use the word. And out of the gate, one of the people you used, I know, is someone who's very important to a lot of people here in the Des Moines Diocese and a lot of young people, Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. And so, to start the show, my thought is to ask, when people think about debates, they think that like what you have to do is rifle through things like definitions and things like this. What brought to your mind the first impulse to say, I'm going to find someone like Frassati and talk about his life and show that his life showed proof to a quote unquote debate?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. The difficulty for me in the debate in general, and it's something that I'm still kind of understanding, is I was kind of being pulled in about 3 different directions. I was a competitive Lincoln Douglas debater in high school and a fairly active and kind of, it was important for me. It introduced me to philosophy. And so I had this kind of like debater's mentality about how to build a great neg case and how to really spread things out and all that kind of stuff. And then on the other hand, I was also thinking that like no one probably except for me cares about that aspect of debate.
Oh no, I did. Just so you know, I was beaming. Thank you for making us feel like we've been listened to. Anyway, keep going.
Well, no. I mean, I'm glad to hear that. I just I was warned by a lot of people that like, Sam, no, there are very few people who are actually going to take this as like negative because the burden of the negative in a debate is the affirmative and the negative don't debate each other as people. They debate the resolution. And the resolution was no one can at the same time be a good Catholic and a true socialist. So I was torn between taking a very maybe technical approach and then on the other hand, really communicating to people who aren't interested in kind of, scoring points technically. And to be honest, the biggest thing that bothered me about the original book and about the resolution is that I think a lot of ordinary people who don't know any better see that and they see it as a kind of claim to impossibility or to even to prohibition, that like, oh, I can't, that's off the table. So what I wanted to do right off the gate was to provide people for whom good Catholic was hopefully not going to become an issue, who they could see as true as socialists, and socialists in this case, I mean people who were affiliated with socialist parties who were working in their historical context under the name of socialism. And the first one was Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, who grew up, of course, in the time of the rise of Mussolini. So the anti-fascist element of his socialism of his time for his context was crucial. And so that was another direction I was pulled in. The third direction was, of course, the direction of like, what does socialism mean in Catholic social teaching? And that was the second section where I talked about the meaning of socialism. But to your question, my thought was just to bring someone who was an instant existential counterfactual to the resolution. And by that, I mean someone that existed who their very existence was a fact that went against the implied fact of the resolution, which was that these people don't exist. So I just showed, here they are. And I gave three, but Frassati was certainly, I think, the most well-known of the three for most people.
Absolutely. And
outside of Tanzania and Rio de Janeiro.
Right. No, that's right. And especially, like I said, I just got done teaching for 2 years a class with the Catechetical Institute here in Des Moines, and who they name each class. They pick a patron saint, and guess who was their patron saint? But Blessed Frassati. So when I heard you, I was like, well, this seems like a natural fit to talk about this in Des Moines. And I think there's a lot that attends to this. For instance, sort of like putting saints up in pedestals and only sort of getting a very, small sliver of their life. Sure. Frassati, in a very short amount of time, he died really early, did a lot. And part of what he did was get in street fights with fascists. And
well, we should be careful here. He was involved in some altercations where the fascist police were putting their hands on his friends, and he stuck up for them. Yeah, but he wasn't just out, throwing hands in the streets.
That's true. I'm probably adding the Oklahoma country music element to this. In my mind, it's like Clint Eastwood, Any Which Way But Loose. But you're right. Like, so he the point being is he was more than willing to go and oppose this real threat from Mussolini, and precisely in doing so, affiliated with what, like, obviously at the time in Italy would be considered socialist parties, quite distinct from communist ones, to be fair as well.
Absolutely. And by the way, the way in which he became a part of the socialist party, he kind of had two wings to his socialism. And politically, he was actually a member of a different party, the Partito Popolare Italiano, which means the populist Italian party. But he was on the left wing of that party that realized it needed to form a strategic alliance with the Socialist Party in order to be able to, well, unsuccessfully oppose the rise of Mussolini, because the coup eventually blew it all out. But that was his political side. His more intellectual side was the work he did for a journal that he helped found called Il Pensiero Popolare, which was on populist thought, and some of the advocacy he did as an intellectual and activist, really. And there you saw, I would say, whenever Saint John Paul II beatified him, he called him the man of the eight virtues, man of the eight beatitudes, right? And that's, I think, where we really saw that come out in his.
And what an awesome name to get called, the man of the eight beatitudes.
Oh my gosh.
Few other titles that you can get that would be better to have. What comes to mind, and why I think this is so powerful to think about, like you said, existential counterfactuals as a sort of debate nerdy way to say we look at people, and people serve as the sort of stuff that we can then have arguments about. And what I mean by this is, in your beautiful book about a primer on philosophy and education, you really dig into the metaphor about priming versus painting. Like, why do we prime objects, particularly wood, before we paint on them? And you make a wonderful point, right? That to children, if a child saw someone priming wood versus painting it, they might get confused. They look very similar. And you make the point that the intellectual work that goes to priming ourselves to have an argument versus having one looks similar, but they have very different things, they're different ends and goals that they're up to. And one of the things that comes up when you talk about the debate, like, and again, like socialism is the term of the debate that had a lot of questions about it. You start to get to this question of how do we prime ourselves to then have an actual good debate about what we want to debate.
That's right.
Because if you just try to paint directly the wood, you can, but there's a reason people have primed wood for centuries before they painted. They want the paint to stick. They want it to withstand the elements, and preparing the wood makes the paint stay better. And the same, of course, occurs when we think about debates we're having. Words don't come freely associated. They don't drop from heaven. We need to do some work if we're going to use the logical terminology, come to terms to then have the debate. I think it's really important, Sam, for people to realize that part of coming to terms to have a debate is to do something like look at the lives of the saints before we then get into the technical debate of yes or no, can you be this or that?
Absolutely. For me, one of my biggest preoccupations across my work as a scholar, as an educator, as a philosopher, but I would say honestly, even like my obsession with soundscapes and music and all the way to this debate is I really have a concern for the real. I often note to people that John 3:16, that famous verse, it's about for God so loved the world. And so the worldliness aspect of the real is for me really important because it's the first thing that our senses come into contact with. It's our most kind of common, ordinary experience. And so for me, I never like to begin with anything that is even slightly out of context. So by giving these three accounts of socialist good Catholics, one in Italy, one in Recife, Brazil, and one in Tanzania, I was trying to bring people into a world. And then from there, to talk a little bit about the meaning of socialism, but contextualized by the tradition and by the most recent tradition of Catholic social teaching. But you'll notice that at the end, I ended biographically because I wanted them to know me. Who's talking to you? What's my, how can you understand this reality of mine that I went to the Franciscan University of Steubenville? I didn't get these ideas from, you might say, the standard left that you might expect or whatever. So yeah, to me, priming versus painting is in some sense making space for us to have a worldly encounter with something so that we can make sure that at all times the question that what we're talking about is real is hopefully later down the road not an obstacle to us.
So Sam, as Bo mentioned by text, he and I are both converts to the faith, and I think when I came into the church, I was maybe naive about how vociferous some of the arguments could get. And I guess what I have in mind is, in some ways, like we know, like if you're a practicing Catholic, you believe X, and whatever I name is probably going to be contested. But I'll just say like the Immaculate Conception, like all Catholics, are supposed to sign on to that. It can get a little bit, I don't know if I'd say murkier, but like more heated when it comes to the issues that your debate was talking about. And to me, the classic example was Pope Benedict's encyclical Caritatis in Veritate, which is in the stream of the great Catholic encyclicals. And George Weigel, a popular Catholic writer, he had an article where he said, like, we can go through that encyclical and we can mark all of the Benedictine elements in gold. And then the elements, yeah, that's right. Yeah. The elements that were written by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in red. And he sort of said, like, he gave the impression we could kind of discard the red. And I guess thinking about some of the debates here in the States, I've had friends on Facebook who have posted articles or statistics, and they say like our current economic arrangement has pulled this many millions of people around the world out of poverty. And so when you look at encyclicals like Benedict's or like John Paul II's, going all the way back to Pius, Our Leo the 13th, I should say,
Sure.
Like, what were they concerned about with industrialization and capitalism? Because you get this impression that, well, look at all the good these things have done. So why have the popes been concerned about some of these developments?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's super historical. I actually think that for one, to actually understand what's motivating uh, Rerum Novarum at the very end of the 19th century, you really have to be willing to kind of take a slightly deeper dive. Talking about priming again, I always back everything up. But you have to take a deeper dive into the rise of industrial capitalism in the early to mid 19th century, and we have a lot of accounts of that. Some are more famous than others. Marx's Capital is probably the most famous, but it's not by any means the only one. Within Catholicism, from Vatican City, there was a publication called Civita Cattolica, which, to my knowledge, is the place where putting together the idea of the social and the idea of justice as like a formal coinage term. Social justice was coined in that period in the 1840s in that publication. So there was a lot of concern for the fact that industrialism, urbanization, all of these things, we were seeing a kind of polis, a kind of city, a kind of social arrangement that had not really risen to, you might say, concern. And a lot of people were concerned about it, including the concern about it being built on the back of expropriation of wealth. And in the UK, for instance, from India, in terms of Spain, from the Americas, and so forth, the rise of chattel slavery and its relation to industrialism. So all of these things all happened before Rerum Novarum. And I always tell people that, like, you can't really start off cold with Rerum Novarum and really think you're going to understand, because it takes the church oftentimes a long time to decide to sort of throw its voice into the public square. And there's a lot of counsel that happens. I think that's good. I ended the debate by pointing out that God uses plural pronouns. Let us make man in our image. The Hebrew tradition says, Rashi says that this is to show Israel that you should never make decisions alone. The encyclicals definitely follow that. And so for me, when we see Rerum Novarum all the way through Quadragesimo Anno and Centesimus Annus and all the things in between, from all the popes, all the way to Pope Benedict, all the way to Laudato Si we see in Francis, the church's concern is with this rise in a certain kind of scale that is unconcerned with the kinds of conviviality and the kinds of attention to the common good, to solidarity, but primarily, I would say, the dignity of the human person that get lost as that scale increases, with no sense of judgment, perhaps. And the church will always, I think, be concerned about this. And I think as we've moved from industrial capitalism to global capitalism, these concerns only increase.
Well, Sam, I think that the context thing is important here too, because part of what this debate brings up is people will go like, well, of course we all know what socialism is. And then you have one of these debates and then people are like, no one really knows what socialism is, or they have, and in the social encyclicals, it's interesting, right? Because I think about Rerum Novarum, and when like the first condemnations of the like using the word socialism as a term comes up in the encyclicals. Well, first of all, the Vatican and Italy are all extremely late to industrializing. On one hand, they're finally having discussions. This goes back to like Blessed Frassati too. They're having discussions about industrialization like 1850 to 1935 that Germany has now, like at that point, had dealt with for 100 years. England too, America in some ways. And so, it starts to be interesting to go back to priming versus painting, getting ready for a discussion versus actually having it. Is, words, not only do they have historical context, but I mean, this is something that I think I took this from, Peter Kreeft from his book on logic. The continual thing that we will always be up to with logic and then philosophy and argumentation. Terms aren't true or false. They're clear or unclear.
That's right.
Propositions are true or false. And so when we say, so it's like to parse out the technicality for everyone listening, a proposition is when we say, an easy one would be like, you should do X or you should not do X. But the term Catholic, the term socialism, the term economy, they're either clear or unclear. And as we go along throughout history, they can be more or less clear.
Mhm.
And so in a context of people having in mind something like the word socialism, 1750, 1850, 1950, and now, and soon in 2050, the question can always come back to, are we clear about our terms? And was a term that was clear now need to be clarified more? The history of theology in many ways is big arguments about that. I've blabbed on, and we're getting close to the break. So we're going to go to the break here. But I think when we get back, in Sam and Bud, just great questions and great discussion so far. I think that's what we're going to talk about is when we look to right now and then the future of what's coming up and these sort of world and global changes that Sam alluded to. Part of the question that we have to say is, as the church, do we have faith enough in our dogmatic tradition, in our encyclical tradition, to say it might be time to re-clarify things that we thought were clear and are not, and that this is the good work that we're willing to do. So, Sam, thank you for joining the show. We'll be back with you after this break. This is the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back right after this. We're back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar join you this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the show. On the show as our guest today, we have Sam Rocha, Associate Professor of Philosophy of Education in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia. Prolific writer and musician. You should check out his books. You can check out his website, samrocha.com. Sam, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks again so much for having me.
So we left at the top of the break the idea of, okay, one of the ongoing reasons why you have to keep hiring philosophers and theologians, right? That we're not just bums, existing off the fumes of everyone who came before us, is, propositions are true and false. And some of those propositions have been true for a long time and they need defended, but maybe we don't need to, so to speak, repeat arguments too much. But terms, and this is coming from Peter Kreeft, this is sort of old school logic. Terms are either clear or unclear. And because of how language works, they can become more or less clear. And part of the work, the priming work, to use Sam's metaphor about priming versus painting. And so in thought, we do primary work and then we do the work itself. But that part of that primary work of priming an argument is to coming to terms, to clarifying terms. And in many ways, a lot of the political discussion, it seems, Sam, if there's anything else that we look out in 2020 and see, is that a lot of things that we assumed were clear, especially in the Catholic world, maybe aren't so much. And that if we're a people of mercy and charity, part of the charitable thing to do when it comes to being philosophers and theologians is seek to clarify what might not be so clear. And that might be a good way to set up, I think, not only your work, but what we mean by education itself and the enduring reason we have to seek education.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can kind of bridge this a little bit, there's two potential metaphors, one real, one fictional, that come to mind. My kids, we go out once every summer and we fish for about a week. And it's very simple, just bobber fishing with worms, but it's effective. But one of the things I don't like is whenever there's a lot of wind or when the water is rough, because then you don't have to just contend with the kids fishing with bobbers and all this other stuff. You also have to deal with all the movement. And I think that whenever we're talking about terms, I'll leave out the other point I was going to bring up. Whenever we talk about terms, we forget that terms also, they take life within the world or within reality, as I said before. So to your earliest point about did the church, especially the Italian church, did it really understand what was going on? I mean, it's also, we have to be generous that what was going on was itself changing. If people aren't afraid to put their heads into the weeds and read about, for instance, all the internal tensions of the First International and the fierce debates between not only Marx, but Bakunin and Kropotkin and people who were very early, very anti-Marxist, very anti-capitalist, very anti-communist, very anti-statist, the mutualists, the 19th century, when the church arrives, they're not arriving to a dead, not moving, still water. Everything is up in upheaval, and the church is throwing down within that, and thank God for that. But I don't like this impression that we get that sort of when the church speaks, the water's still, everything stops moving. And that gets to your second point, which is, if I could add just one little bit of complexity, it's one thing to clarify for terms to be clear and unclear. But if I'm taking a picture of a very foggy day, I don't want my picture to look like a clear day, because that is an overdetermined, overexposed, or whatever metaphorical language we want to use there. But if things are actually foggy, they have to look foggy. And I think the church's terms over time are not just relating to a still, pristine, clear day. It's often a foggy day. John Paul II in Centesimus Annus, for instance, makes a reference to that true socialism usage in Quadragesimo Anno. And he actually does this after 1989, after the fall of Russian Soviet communism. And he says, now that the true socialism has passed, so he's almost speaking in this he is speaking in a kind of post-communist era. So all of these things, if a Catholic wants to really engage with social teaching, and in particular the meaning of words like socialism, communism, capitalism, all these things, you have to realize that this is the stew that we're all in, and we're in it right now, as you pointed out. And I think it's really important. This is where the philosopher and the theologian, who bring a certain amount of technique, can remind us. What I do worry about, though, is about a certain kind of popular religion speaker, or kind of motivational speaker, or sometimes apologists, who skip the technique for the sake of simplifying quickly, which is appealing, but I think that actually does more damage than good in the end.
Yeah, Sam, speaking personally for myself, when I think about stepping into the public square, like, one thing that can be frustrating for me is it feels like the terms have already been set. And so, like, when you talk about U.S. electoral politics, it feels like there's very strict boundaries around, like, what's an acceptable opinion with respect to economics. And so we can be tempted, I think, to try to find, like, some option to withdraw from the world, or just to have, like, just communities in our place. But as Catholics, of course, like, that's not really available to us, because we believe ourselves to be salt and light in the world. And I'm guessing, do you have any input or, like, thoughts about how do we navigate sort of, like, trying to move the needle using, like, standard electoral politics or the democratic process with, like, you look at someone like Dorothy Day, and there was a sense where the standard process was so lost that, like, it starts really locally and on the ground. So how do we kind of hold those two things in balance?
Yeah, I have to admit that my mind is changing on this. I think actually some people will be a bit shocked if you read my 2017 collection of essays. That's really my thought from about 2008 to about 2016. Listening to my debate, I think you'd wonder kind of where I stand. For a very long time, that kind of anarchic Dorothy Day stance struck me as the viable stance to have, especially within a particularly binary political system of two parties. At the same time, people like Frassati and many others who have worked within the sort of mainstream politics have inspired me, and in particular within the climate we're in, because it's also a question of, like, degree, right? And then they've inspired me to sort of not totally abandon, but to be a little bit more suspicious of the kind of exceptional status of Catholics. The bishops have taught us very clearly, I think, internationally, but especially in the United States and in the English-speaking world, that the Catholics has a duty to inform their conscience and to vote and participate in politics according to a well-formed conscience. And so, some of this thought on conscience and things like that have really helped me move more deeply, I think, into aligning myself with the Catholic teaching, and not just taking a sort of cult of personality of the venerable, servant of God, Dorothy Day, as much as I love her. Also taking certain things with a certain grain of salt, I think.
Well, I know that maybe I'm, like, overdoing this point about how what you talk about with education plays into, like, our, like you said, coming to reality, coming to terms, so that we can, and like you said, I love your point about, if you're going to make a clear picture, clarity sometimes is being clear about fogginess. It's a great point, right? Like, that we can't make that category confusion, that being clear, sometimes the best clarity you can give is there is no clarity.
Yeah.
Right? That is the clear picture.
Yeah.
But you had a wonderful tweet appealing. I mean, I think pointing back to something you've written elsewhere, that the only outcomes of education, you say, is you and me and us. And as someone who has seen in my professional life as an educator be told more and more about like data-driven decisions and these great arcane Byzantine calculuses in the sky that's going to make us like understand whether our lesson plan worked better or not. This idea that the actual outcomes is people, I think, speaks to what you're saying as well about this third party, no party, Benedict option versus like getting our hands dirty. The idolatry of every single one of those things is, if we stop thinking that the outcome is us and that the outcome is the party or purity or whatever it is, that's where we lose the incarnational focus of everything we're talking about. The outcome is us. The outcome is people. The outcome is us as individuals and us and as a community. The outcome is never the party, the process, these things. And, that can sound like so much platitudes, except sometimes we have to keep repeating platitudes because they're so easy to forget.
I totally agree. I mean, look, first and foremost, I'm selective and wary about where I drive my flag post into, but I identify most openly and most comfortably as a personalist. And I'm willing to kind of carry all the weight and baggage that comes with that, both technically and in a more basic way. And in many ways, my reason for going onto the debate had a lot more to do with my personalism and the fact that within personalism, from Mounier all the way to today, there is a room for a kind of worldly political apparatus that would include democratic socialism among its livers. So I claim, and so I argued. And this gets us right into the kind of educational discussion. First of all, politics and education go hand in hand, at least as far back as Plato, right? I mean, the question of education's political character, it's not only about the civic arrangement, but it's also about the fact that from Plato forward, the civic arrangement is a reflection and an analogy of the soul. And for me, this analogy and to the soul is that whenever we fight for justice in the public square, we are engaging in work that is potentially redemptive at the level of our very innermost being. And to me, this is a profound truth that the Greeks have impressed upon our tradition, and that I see as the reason for, or the justification for, the claim that whenever we engage in educational or political work, the only outcome, the only acceptable outcome is us, and not only the external us, but also the internal us, also our collective conscience and the soul that we all hope to be redeemed in Christ.
Well, and I think that that metaphor, and again, like that, it so struck me when I read it from Plato all those years ago, is that, the soul and the city are at least analogies. And then, like, in many ways, the Western debate about politics and ethics is like, how much of an analogy? But certainly since Augustine, the church has really thrown it in there and to say like, oh no, really a very good analogy that we have to pay attention to. But I think I interrupted you, but I think this was on line with something that you were going to ask.
No, it's just, you're just helping me get my feet set a little better. It's early here on the West Coast, Yeah, in addition to personalism, I'd say I'm an Augustinian with Franciscan spiritual delights, you might say. And so Benedict XVI's Augustinianism in particular has been a huge source of inspiration for me, of really allowing myself or permitting myself to kind of eat that Platonic line, hook, line, and sinker, and really take that analogy to the soul seriously. What it does is it puts us into a particular kind of feedback loop of recollection, or the word is anamnesis, both in Scripture, Paul, Luke, but also in Plato, where in the Meno he says all learning and inquiry is but recollection. The word he uses there is anamnesis. That's the words of Christ at the Last Supper: remember me, do this in remembrance of me. Benedict says in his book on conscience that we ought to use anamnesis as our kind of one of our main ways of understanding what the conscience is. And so the whole idea is that when we act in educational terms and political terms in the public square, we are not only just vaguely doing something, but we're literally engaged in a kind of memory work. We're building memory. We're building memory for future generations. We're tapping into the memory of our ancestors and our traditions. And to me, that kind of idea of the us being a really big anamnesis, remembrance us, it's really inspiring, but it's also daunting, because you realize that there's a lot more life at stake than just my little individualistic light and by the life. But one last thing I would say is that sometimes the negatives aren't as clear. The views I'm putting forth in every direction are deeply anti-individualistic. So the person is not an individual on my account, and also deeply hostile towards an idea of freedom that is only negative. This conception of freedom is deeply, deeply positive, in the sense that it's not just freedom from things or freedom as license, but also a freedom for things, and a freedom that's directed towards a good of the good life, human flourishing, the common good, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Sam, another great Canadian thinker, Charles Taylor, he has this notion of social imaginaries, and sometimes when we approach moral issues, if we fall short, it might not be a matter of like choosing X over Y in real black and white terms, but it might be a matter of like our social imaginaries need to be expanded, because sometimes, like I said, like the water we're swimming in, like the terms have already been set. And I love your point about anamnesis and kind of like maybe exploding or expanding categories that we sort of took for granted what they meant. I guess thinking creatively, like if you were to say like Catholics, like in what are some ways that like we could have our social imaginary expanded around the kind of topics we've been circling today?
I hope I'm not going to be too controversial in answering your question in the way I will. By the way, Charles Taylor is another great Catholic socialist, one of the found kind of most important people of the New Left in the late 60s, and founder of the New Democratic Party, the NDP. So he's an orange socialist Catholic, and God bless him for that. But to me, in the present tense, I think sometimes I think social imaginaries emerge not only in a kind of not only as an expressive capacity, but sometimes they express themselves through a moral concern. So, for instance, like during the civil rights movement in the United States, I think that the social imaginary of its time was for nuns and priests to lock arms and walk with Martin Luther King Jr. and everyone through the streets, and to call out to society to imagine an end to the Jim Crow South. And I think the abolitionist sentiment 100 years before that is important. I think today we're living through a time in the United States, at least, and also more globally. But I don't want to just talk about it in terms of, Black Lives Matter, like but I want to get it even inside the nest of the church that I've been cradled in my entire life. One way that I think American Catholics could kind of open the lens of their social imaginary, certainly through philosophy and theology, I think that's all great. But I even think culturally, to look at the different cultural expressions of Catholicism that are on offer and think a bit about it. I grew up playing basketball on a cement slab that used to be the foundation for the chapel of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Whenever my small town, there was a Mexican chapel for Mexican liturgy, Spanish liturgy, and a white church, St. Patrick's Church. In other words, I grew up in West Texas that was racially segregated up until like the 80s. Bringing together people in bilingual masses and all of the tensions that comes out, to me, that's a very real social imaginary. And Taylor has this on his heart when he talks about multiculturalism and interculturalism and the encounter of culture as an encounter with persons. So for me, one really practical way for people is to confront their own provincialisms. I know I've had to do that up here in Vancouver. I'm kind of out of place up here. But it's been wonderful. For instance, I've gotten to understand and know in a deeper and better way the Filipino community, which is really kind of the bastion of Catholicism here. And it's been a great gift to my faith.
Yeah, I mean, moving up here to Iowa, I've had to learn how food is not spicy at all. And that was, I'm teasing. I know, I think that's exactly right. Is, one of the things we find in our life is the sort of mobility that is hard for any of us to ignore. I mean, like, I think all three of us, I think either in speeches or something we've written, have talked about the importance of place, but I know all three of us have moved all over the place because of like what life is like, the past 15 to 20 years for scholars. It is happening. People are mobile. And you look at, work from, someone else that we've had on, Chris Arnatti, who talks about the fact of mobility versus immobility in the front row and the back row. We start exploring those dynamics, and that starts to be the question that we start to ask ourselves is, if we're going to have to live with things that may or maybe not are destructive, like mobility, what is the way, though, that we're going to find not a silver lining, but resurrection? Sure. The power of God to take things that aren't perfect, or in fact are bad, and that we can see in them flowering of new life. And I know that's a huge thing, and there's like 1 minute left, but I would end the show for us. Yeah.
Well, I would just slightly push back just a little bit fraternally, because in some cases the kinds of social imaginary that need to be awakened are not so much to things where movement is being introduced to stasis, but where there's always been movement, but our static imaginaries haven't been able to see them. So, for instance, I hear people in Los Angeles or Sacramento saying, speak English. And it's like, the name of your city is literally in Spanish. Think about that for 3 seconds. My goodness. Right. England is across the ocean. Like, seriously, like, pay attention, right? I think a lot of the American churches, especially the Protestant nation of America, it has not been particularly agile. And so another reason, going back to your opening question, that I wanted to present those 3 cases was also to present 3 cases that were broadly intercontinental: South America, the Portuguese-speaking South America, Africa, and then the Mediterranean aspect of Europe, where I think oftentimes Catholics forget that to be Catholic is to be a part of a global church, and that global church is going to look radically different. And thinking with the church means literally thinking in this global way. And now this isn't globalism, the scary version, but it is, I think, a universalism that Paul calls us to when he says that, in Christ we have no Jew or Greek, no servant or free, no woman or man.
I think that's exactly right. The difference between an abstract globalism and a universal global church. Beautifully said. Sam, it's been fantastic to have you on the show. And I'd love to have you back at some point. Sam Rocha, Associate Professor at the University of British Columbia. Many books that you should go check out. You can find all of this at samrocha.com. Sam, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you both. I really appreciate this.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in ourselves, in our family, our city, our state, our nation, our world, the galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.